On the whole, Flaxborough prided itself on being the sort of town where nothing untoward ever happened, or at least where things happened so discreetly that the vicar could continue his sermon uninterrupted. It was a habit of the place to turn a blind eye not only to mischief but also to melody, for the parish choir, though diligent, was never precisely tuneful. It was therefore not the music that startled Mr. Rudge, the choirmaster, that particular Sunday morning. It was the note, or rather the note about the note. He found it after the morning service, folded neatly beneath hymnal number 47, All Creatures of Our God and King, which the sopranos had, as usual, interpreted as a kind of high-pitched lament. The handwriting was small, precise, and slightly slanted to a schoolteacher's hand, perhaps, or someone accustomed to filling parish registers. It read, simply, "The wrong that silenced a child still lies beneath the organ loft. Let it be righted before the next anthem is sung." Mr. Rudge blinked several times before assuming, as most sensible men would, that it was either a prank or a piece of moralistic poetry. He pocketed it without mentioning it to anyone, though inevitably someone noticed. That someone was Mrs. Pocklington, a woman to whom the word observant applied in its most perilous sense. Her pew lay 2 rows behind the choir stalls and afforded her a near-professional view of comings and goings. She saw Mr. Rudge stoop, retrieve, and pocket something with the air of a man concealing contraband, which, by the time she told her friend Mrs. Clapp, became a small sealed envelope, possibly money, possibly indecent photographs. By the time the matter reached the Rose and Crown public house at 5 o'clock, the story had evolved further. The choirmaster had been blackmailed over a musical irregularity, and the bishop himself was said to be taking a personal interest. In point of fact, the bishop was enjoying a quiet weekend in Lincoln, blissfully unaware of any such disturbance. But news in Flaxborough did not rely on facts to travel, only on vowels well pronounced and plentifully exchanged. Reverend Flitch, the vicar, heard of it last, which was typical. His parishioners preferred their clergyman as a latecomer to scandal, allowing them to enjoy a moral head start. By the time he confronted Mr. Rudge in the vestry that evening, the choirmaster was already weary of explaining himself. "A note, you say?" asked Flitch, peering over his spectacles. "Yes, vicar. Found it beneath hymnal 47. And it spoke of, what was the phrase? A wrong that silenced a child." They stood for a while amid the musty smell of cassocks and candle wax. Somewhere beyond the vestry door, faint strains of laughter could be heard, the younger choristers lingering to share jokes unfit for ecclesiastical ears. Reverend Flitch sighed. We shall assume for the moment that it was mischief. Some boyish attempt at drama, perhaps. "I suppose so," said Rudge, though the handwriting didn't look youthful. "Neat as a clerk's ledger," the vicar frowned at that. "Well, keep it safe. We'll not make a fuss until there's reason." There was reason, as it turned out. Before the next anthem was sung, that evening's evensong was notable for 2 things: an uncharacteristically full attendance, thanks to Mrs. Pocklington's energetic whispering, and the complete absence of Master Edwin Cotterell, one of the younger choir boys. His parents assumed he was at practice, Mr. Rudge assumed he was ill, and the vicar, being an optimist by faith and temperament, assumed nothing at all. It was only when the final hymn began and the boys processed past the pews that someone noticed an empty space in the line. A missing voice is an unmusical thing, but in Flaxborough it was also the beginning of an event. Later that night, as the organist locked up, a draught blew across the chancel and lifted a corner of the choir stall's velvet drapery. Beneath it, dimly visible in the lantern light, was a small shoe, neatly polished, turned slightly on its side, as though its owner had stepped neatly out of it and gone somewhere else. Inspector Purbright, when he was telephoned the next morning, took the news without visible alarm. He merely asked, "How old is the boy?" 13, sir," came the reply. "And he was last seen in church?"
"Yes, sir, during evensong," Purbright nodded to himself.
"Well," he said mildly, "the Almighty's house has hidden many things before. Let's see if this one's prepared to give them up." By Monday morning, the note beneath the hymnal had multiplied into 4 versions, none of them remotely resembling the original. One involved a confession of love between the choirmaster and the vicar's housekeeper. Another, a plot to rob the church collection box. And the more popular rumour, advanced by Mrs. Pocklington herself, suggested that the boy's disappearance was a sacrifice to restore moral order in the choir. Inspector Purbright, who had returned from a long and unhurried lunch when the first of these tales reached him, found the entire matter far more instructive than alarming. In Flaxborough, rumour was the first civic reflex, investigation a distant second. He decided, therefore, to let the gossip run its course before it ran out. The Cotterills lived on the edge of the market square, above the kind of shop that sold everything except what one might reasonably expect: jars of barley sugar, shoe polish, postcards of long-demolished buildings, and occasionally, at Christmas, umbrellas shaped like canes. Mrs. Cotterill was tearful but not distraught. Her husband, a clerk for the gas board, sat glumly smoking his pipe as though affronted by the suggestion that his son might be missing. "No trouble at home, Mr. Cotterill?" Purbright asked gently.
"None at all."
"Quiet lad, Edwin. Bit dreamy, maybe. He's fond of his music. Did he have many friends in the choir?" "Kept to himself, mostly. The others tease him some. He's not much good at singing, truth be told." Purbright nodded slowly. It struck him as faintly ironic that the boy who never sang should have vanished from the choir. He left them with the impression of a man who would think deeply before doing anything at all, which, in Purbright's experience, made people talk more freely after he'd gone. By afternoon, he had spoken with Reverend Flitch, who seemed relieved to delegate worry to someone better equipped for it. "It's very strange, Inspector," the vicar said, dabbing his brow.
"Edwin wasn't a naughty child, only—"
Withdrawn. "There was that note, of course, but surely it can't be connected. Do you still have it?" Yes, here." Purbright examined the scrap of paper in the vestry light. The handwriting was careful, mature, with a curious upward flick at each line's end, not unlike the hand of someone accustomed to signing things with moral authority. "You've shown this to anyone?" he asked. "Only Mr. Rudge and Mrs. Pocklington." Purbright's eyes twinkled faintly. The vicar hesitated. "She—"
"Overheard something, I believe. That was enough."
In Flaxborough, overhearing was less an accident than a civic duty. By evening, half the congregation had convinced itself that the missing boy had run away after discovering some terrible secret in the vestry. The other half maintained he had been kidnapped by persons offended by modern hymn choices. The organist, meanwhile, confessed to no one that he had heard faint footsteps during evensong. Light, hesitant, moving behind the organ loft where no one ought to have been. Purbright listened to all of it with polite patience. To most officers, the tale would have seemed ludicrous. To him, it was a map of the town's mind. The truth in Flaxborough was never hidden by silence, but by excessive conversation. That night, he walked briefly through the churchyard, his breath clouding faintly in the cold. The lamps along the path cast uneven circles of light on the wet stones. Somewhere inside, the organ gave a ghostly wheeze as the wind touched its pipes. Purbright paused by the choir stalls where the boy's shoe had been found. He crouched, peered beneath, and saw only dust, a scrap of wax, and the dull gleam of a copper coin pressed into the floorboards. Old, worn, deliberately placed. "Curious," he murmured, pocketing it. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added softly, "Well, Edwin, let's see what song you've left for us to hear." By Tuesday afternoon, the school playground had become the unofficial bureau of investigation. Every child had seen, heard, or dreamt something about Edwin Cotterill, and most were prepared to swear to it. A few even claimed to have seen him boarding a train, though none could agree on its direction. Inspector Purbright, who had once remarked that children made the most imaginative liars because adults encouraged them to, decided to begin with the two least confident witnesses. Colin Frere and Martin Daggett were 12, awkward, and extremely aware of each other's potential for betrayal. They sat side by side in the vestry chairs, fidgeting beneath the benign gaze of a framed archbishop. Purbright, in his mild and reasonable way, made no attempt to intimidate them. He simply waited for the silence to become unbearable. "Well," he said at last, "you were both at choir practice on Saturday evening?" "Yes, sir," Colin answered quickly. "We were polishing the psalm for Sunday." "Ah, and did you see Edwin Cotterill?" "Yes," said Colin. "No," said Martin. The contradiction, arriving so promptly, seemed to relieve them both of tension. Purbright folded his hands. "Perhaps you could each tell me what you remember." Colin went first. "Edwin," he said, "had been unusually quiet that night, standing apart while the others teased him about his cracked voice. After practice, he had lingered in the chancel, pretending to tidy hymn sheets. Then someone had come in through the vestry door, a tall person in a dark coat, and Edwin had followed them out. Martin's account was different. He remembered no visitor, only that Edwin had been asked by Mr. Rudge to fetch something from the loft, after which he simply hadn't come back. "We thought he'd gone home," Martin said, glancing at Colin as if hoping for rescue. Purbright asked no more questions than necessary. He knew boys lied in pairs for companionship, not conspiracy, yet somewhere between their versions lay a thread he could use. A tall figure, a request, a disappearance. As they left, the inspector remained seated, his eyes wandering to the shelf of hymnals beside him. He drew one out at random, thumbed its edge, and noticed something faintly odd. The upper corners of several pages were folded down, not as a reader's habit, but marking specific verses. The chosen hymns all spoke of confession, redemption, and, once, silence. When Mr. Rudge arrived moments later, full of weary dignity and the smell of furniture polish, Purbright held up the book. "These hymns," he said mildly, "were they part of Sunday's service?" Rudge peered, frowning. "No, that's one of the spare copies, I think. The boys borrow them sometimes. Does Edwin borrow one?"
"Not usually."
He was tone-deaf, poor child. Purbright replaced the hymnal, his expression unreadable. "And yet," he said, "he never missed a service. Outside, the afternoon light slanted through the stained glass, turning the floor into a patchwork of uneasy colour." Reverend Flitch appeared, his thin smile stretched between nerves and hope.
"Any progress, Inspector?"
"A few small things," Purbright replied. "One learns more from what people recall differently than from what they agree upon." The vicar blinked, uncertain whether that was optimism or irony. "You don't think anything dreadful has happened?" "Oh, dreadful things are rare," Purbright said gently. "But foolish ones, those we have in abundance." As he stepped out into the churchyard, he noticed Mrs. Pocklington hovering near the gate, pretending to admire a yew tree. Her curiosity was as constant as weather. "Good afternoon, Inspector. Such a pity, poor child, run off, they say." "No one's sure yet," Purbright answered, offering his most tranquil smile. "Though I imagine you'll know before I do." She tittered, pleased and faintly chastened. "I only hope the vicarage is blameless in all this. You hear things, you know." "I dare say you do," he murmured, and walked on. That evening, back at the station, Purbright laid the hymnal beside the coin he had found beneath the choir stall. Both seemed trifling, yet both suggested intention. Someone had marked certain hymns for an audience that might never have sung them. Someone had left a token beneath the seat of a silenced boy. He wrote a few lines in his notebook, paused, and stared thoughtfully at the window where the lamplight turned the glass into a dim mirror. "People," he said quietly to himself, "seldom hide what they're ashamed of. They hide what they think others should be ashamed for." The church bell sounded 9. Somewhere beyond it, faint as breath, a single note from the organ drifted into the night, one that no hand seemed to play. By Wednesday morning, the disappearance of Edwin Cotterill had ceased to be merely a matter of concern and become instead a social obligation. Every respectable household felt required to have an opinion, preferably one phrased as moral instruction. Mrs. Pocklington believed it a punishment for modern hymn arrangements. Mr. Rudge spoke of lax parenting, and the Reverend Flitch, worn thin by sympathy calls, wondered aloud whether God himself might be tiring of committees. Into this atmosphere of righteous agitation swept Mrs. Cordelia Wapshot, a woman whose arrival in any matter gave it instant gravity. She was the parish's most distinguished benefactress and its least musical soul, though she had once pronounced herself deeply moved by a fugue. That morning she entered the vicarage as though conducting an audit of heaven. "Reverend," she announced, before sitting down, "I am not a woman easily alarmed, but I cannot allow the present situation to continue unchecked." Reverend Flitch, who had been halfway through an apologetic biscuit,
rose with the dignity of a man already defeated.
"The police are attending to it, Mrs. Wapshot. Inspector Purbright assures me—" "I am not referring to the boy, Reverend," she interrupted, removing one glove with ceremonial precision. "I am referring to the organ fund." It transpired that her generous donation of £50, pledged a fortnight earlier for the purchase of new pipes, had not appeared in the parish accounts. To Mrs. Wapshot, this could mean only one thing: embezzlement cloaked in incense. "I do not suggest dishonesty," she continued, "but I do not rule it out either." Purbright was summoned before lunch. When he arrived, he found the vicar red-faced, the benefactress pale with principle, and the parish secretary trembling faintly over the ledger. The missing amount was indeed absent, though the arithmetic suggested confusion rather than cunning. Still, the coincidence of lost money and a missing boy made too tidy a story for Flaxborough to resist. Purbright examined the books, his expression politely blank. "You say the donation was made in cash?" "Of course," said Mrs. Wapshot. "A cheque would have been vulgar." "And who received it?" "Mr. Rudge, naturally. I placed it in his hand after evensong. He assured me it would be safe." The vicar gave a helpless nod. "He did mention it to me, Inspector, though I confess I hadn't realized the sum hadn't yet been deposited." "Where is Mr. Rudge now?" Purbright asked.
"In the church, rehearsing with what remains of the choir," Flitch said miserably. They found the choirmaster at the organ, coaxing a mournful tune from pipes that wheezed like old men in a cold wind.
When told of the missing funds, Rudge's mouth fell open with almost theatrical indignation. "Good heavens, I placed the envelope in the parish safe that very night," he protested.
"Oh, I can swear to it."
"Would anyone have seen you?" Purbright inquired softly. "Only Edwin, perhaps. He was tidying the stalls at the time." A stillness settled, subtle and heavy. Rudge looked around as if the name itself had drawn a draught through the church.
"You don't think—" "No, absurd."
"The boy wouldn't have known what it was." Purbright's voice remained calm.
"How many people have access to the safe?"
"The vicar, myself, and Mrs. Pocklington, since she manages the flower fund." That last name drifted into the air like a note slightly off-key. Purbright inclined his head, thanked him, and made no comment. But later, outside in the churchyard, he paused beside a bench and jotted something into his notebook. Donation. Cash. Witnessed by missing boy. Safe accessible by 3. Rumor. Traveling faster than truth. By evening, the matter had acquired its own momentum. The town now spoke of the boy and the money as if they were the same thing. At the Rose and Crown, patrons speculated whether Edwin had fled with the envelope. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pocklington hinted that certain people had long been careless with parish property. Through it all, Purbright remained serenely unhurried. He visited the church once more after dark, letting himself in with the vicar's permission. The place smelled of polish and damp hymn books. He stood by the organ loft, listening to the echo of his own breath. On the vestry desk lay a sheaf of music sheets. Beneath them, he noticed a faint indentation where something rectangular had recently rested, about the size of an envelope. He touched the surface lightly, then drew his fingers back, feeling the sticky trace of candle wax. He smiled to himself, a small, almost imperceptible curve of the lips. Someone, he thought, had lit a candle, not for devotion, but for light. And someone else had been watching. Thursday's choir practice began under a sky the colour of old pewter. The church, though dimly lit and mostly empty, carried a faint sense of expectancy, something quieter than fear, but less innocent than hope. Mr. Rudge moved among the boys with the solemnity of a man arranging his own defence before an unseen jury. His hands fluttered over the sheet music, his voice deliberately steady. "Now then, from the Gloria, softly this time for heaven's sake." The boys sang, some reluctantly, some without conviction. The sound rose unevenly to the rafters, brushed against the timbers, and fell again. Only one voice, clear but uncertain, stood apart. Purbright, seated unobtrusively near the back, listened with his head slightly inclined. He was not there for music. He was there for movement. Halfway through the rehearsal, the lights flickered. A draught swept down the aisle, making the candles gutter. Rudge looked up, annoyed. "Wind under the door, that's all. Continue." But before the final note of the verse, a sharp crack echoed from the organ loft, followed by the unmistakable scent of something scorched. Then silence. Someone had knocked over one of the tall candles beside the lectern. It struck the wooden floor, rolled, and came to rest in a smear of molten wax. The nearest chorister, Martin Daggett, let out a cry, pointing. Reverend Flitch, entering at that moment, saw the scene and froze. For there, by the base of the organ, lay the vicar himself. His face pale, his collar skewed, one hand limp against the polished wood. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Purbright rose, calm but quick.
"Open that window," he said.
"And fetch water." He knelt beside the vicar, noting the faint pulse and the thin sheen of sweat along the hairline. The smell was not quite of candle smoke. It was sharper, metallic, faintly bitter. When the doctor arrived, a brisk man whose bedside manner resembled a disciplinary hearing, he pronounced Reverend Flitch suffering from some sort of mild poisoning. It was not fatal, he said, though another dose might have been. What the dose consisted of remained uncertain, though the tea the vicar had sipped before rehearsal provided an obvious starting point. By evening, Flaxborough knew the details with its usual embellishments. Mrs. Pocklington insisted that arsenic had been sprinkled into the communion wine. Mr. Rudge, meanwhile, was said to have fainted in the vestry, which he had not, though he privately wished he had, if only to appear more tragic. Inspector Purbright interviewed those present with his usual civility. Each account, though breathless, revealed the same curious omission. No one had seen who lit the extra candle that evening. Normally, 2 stood by the lectern. That night, there had been 3. He visited the vestry again after dark. The air still carried a faint echo of smoke and disinfectant. On the desk sat a half-empty teacup, cold now beside a small dish of sugar lumps. Purbright studied it without touching, his gaze lingering on a ring-shaped stain near the rim, perfectly round, unshaken by trembling hands. Someone else had poured that tea. From outside came the muffled toll of the town clock, striking 9. He thought briefly of the coin he had found beneath the choir stall and the marked hymnal, tokens of something rehearsed, something almost ritual. The boy's disappearance, the missing money, the poisoning. None seemed violent in nature, yet all shared an oddly deliberate precision. The following morning, the vicar, weak but talkative, summoned Purbright to his bedside. "Inspector," he murmured, "it's absurd, but I've had the queerest thought. What if the note you saw, the one about the wrong done to a child, wasn't written recently at all? What if it had been waiting there for years? Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. You mean placed for discovery rather than message?
Yes, like a
Ghost of a confession. He left the vicar to his rest, stepping once more into the grey daylight. The choir boys, dismissed for the week, passed him on the lane, their chatter subdued. Behind them, the church stood closed and silent, its windows glinting faintly in the weak sun. As he reached the gate, Purbright looked back and noticed a single candle still standing in the window of the vestry, burnt nearly to the base, yet stubbornly alight. He watched it a moment longer, until the flame wavered, bent, and went out. Friday brought a faint drizzle that seemed designed to wash gossip into every gutter. Flaxborough had entered its favourite phase of a scandal, the period of informed speculation. Each resident had developed a theory that proved their moral superiority, and nearly all of them involved sin beneath a surplice. The poisoning of Reverend Flitch had fused neatly with Edwin Cotterell's disappearance and Mrs. Wapshot's missing donation, forming a single, satisfyingly lurid story which nobody could resist improving. Inspector Purbright, who neither improved nor denied stories, spent the morning in quiet visits. His first call was to Mrs. Pocklington, whose tea tray was already laid as though for interrogation. She insisted he take the best chair and began speaking before he asked a single question. "It's all connected, Inspector."
I've said so from the start.
That note about the wrong that silenced a child, well, everyone knows the church committee was forced to dismiss a choir boy years ago. Terrible business. The poor lad's mother went to pieces, left the town entirely. Purbright stirred his tea. "And what, may I ask, was the reason for the dismissal?" "Oh, nothing proved, of course," she said, lowering her voice to a scandalized whisper. "Something to do with theft from the collection plate. Though there were those who said the blame was misplaced. And who do you suppose led the inquiry?" He knew before she spoke the name, Mr. Rudge. Later, in the parish archives, Purbright found the record she'd hinted at. The handwriting, precise and upward slanted, matched the anonymous note almost perfectly. Dated 20 years earlier, it described the expulsion of one choir boy, Herbert Cotterill, for conduct unbecoming. The entry was signed by the then choirmaster, Lionel Rudge. That afternoon, Purbright paid another visit to the church. The drizzle had deepened to a fine mist, and the air smelled of wet stone and old incense. He found Rudge seated at the organ, fingers resting on silent keys. The man's expression was weary, almost contrite. "You've heard, I suppose," Purbright said gently. "Of the old choir record?" Rudge gave a thin smile. "I expected you would. It was all very unfortunate. The boy took a few coins."
I tried to be lenient, yet he was dismissed. "The vicar insisted," Rudge replied too quickly. "And his mother, well, she made a dreadful scene."
"Accused me of all manner of impropriety."
"Utter nonsense." Purbright regarded him steadily.
"Herbert Cotterill."
"Any relation, you think, to young Edwin?"
Rudge hesitated just a fraction too long. "I wouldn't know. Cotterill's a common enough name." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Though in a town this size, families have a way of looping back upon themselves." He left the church without further comment. Outside, the rain had become persistent, running in silver threads down the gravestones. Purbright stood under the porch, his hands in his pockets, thinking of the folded hymnal pages, confession, silence, redemption. Someone, it seemed, had decided the past had not been atoned for. That evening, in his modest sitting room above the police station, Purbright read again through his notes. 3 threads ran through every conversation: the note about the silenced child, the missing donation, and the act of poisoning, each subtle, deliberate, bound by a moral language that sounded more like vengeance than crime. He considered the teacup, the candle wax, the coin beneath the store. all small gestures, all ceremonial. The pattern felt more like penance than malice. Whoever orchestrated it believed they were righting an old wrong, perhaps even saving souls in the process. At 9 o'clock, a knock sounded at his door. It was Sergeant Malley bringing the evening's update. "The vicar's improving, sir. Doctor says he'll be up by Sunday."
Also, there's been a letter. Purbright took the envelope.
It was unmarked, plain, the writing neat and slanted.
Inside lay a single sheet. "The voice that should have been heard will soon be heard again.
"The guilty will sing whether they wish to or not." Purbright folded it slowly, set it down, and looked at the ceiling as though the thought above it were clearer than the air.
"Malley," he said at last, "we may be dealing with someone who believes they're conducting a very long hymn." The sergeant frowned.
"Meaning, sir?" Purbright's tone was almost kind. "Meaning it's time we listened to who's out of tune?" Saturday morning broke in a hush that felt deliberate, as though the town itself had paused to hear what might happen next. The rain had cleared, leaving the pavements dark and shining, and Inspector Purbright, after a breakfast of unenthusiastic toast, walked toward the edge of town where the older houses leaned together like gossips, sharing a secret. He had received a note, hand-delivered, unsigned, inviting him to tea with a lady who knows something that must now be said. The address belonged to Mrs. Gladys Penrith, a retired schoolmistress of indeterminate age and firm moral construction. Her garden was immaculate, her curtains less so as they trembled at his approach. She greeted him at the door, wearing black lace gloves and the expression of one who has waited too long to be believed. "You're very punctual, Inspector. I respect that."
"Most men aren't?" Purbright smiled politely and allowed himself to be ushered into a sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender and disuse.
On the mantelpiece stood a row of faded school photographs, children in choir robes, all arranged in stiff, forced rows. "You taught here in Flaxborough, Mrs. Penrith?"
"For 30 years, scripture and discipline. I saw more sin disguised as innocence than most vicars see in a lifetime." She poured tea with a trembling but practiced hand.
"I understand you're asking questions about the Cotterill boy." "Among others," Purbright replied evenly. "You knew his family?" "Not the present one." "The earlier. Herbert Cotterill, his uncle, or so I've been told."
"I taught him, you see, long before the scandal."
A shy, bright boy. Couldn't sing to save his life, but he loved the sound of music. Would stay after service just to listen to the organ. She paused, and the teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. Then one day he was accused of stealing from the collection plate. No one believed his protests. He left the choir, his mother took ill, and within the year they were gone. No one spoke of them again. Purbright watched her quietly.
"And you believed him innocent?"
"I did, because I knew who really took it." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. "It was another boy, one whose father sat on the church council. Mr. Rudge knew.
"He swore me to silence, said it was best for the parish."
But the guilt of it never left me." The inspector's face did not change, but his eyes sharpened.
"And this you've kept for 20 years?"
"Until the note," she said softly. "When I heard about that message under the hymnal, I thought, it's Herbert's doing, or someone speaking for him."
"Maybe through that poor child, Edwin. They share the same eyes, Inspector. I saw him once at evensong, and it was like seeing a ghost." She leaned forward, her voice trembling now with something between fear and relief.
"There's more. The night before the vicar's collapse, I walked past the church.
I saw a light through the vestry window."
Someone was inside Mr. Rudge, I think, and a smaller figure beside him. They were arguing. I heard the words, forgiveness and debt. Then the light went out. Purbright nodded slowly. "You didn't mention this before." "I thought it unseemly to spy," she said, with a hint of pride. "But after what's happened, I cannot hold it in any longer. Some sins, Inspector, echo down the generations until someone dares to sing the last verse." He finished his tea in silence, letting her words settle. Outside, the The faint chime of the church clock drifted through the drizzle that had returned unnoticed. When he rose to leave, Mrs. Penrith followed him to the door. "You'll find him, won't you?" "The boy? I'll find the truth," Purbright said gently, "and perhaps that will be the same thing." As he stepped into the damp air, he glanced back once through her window. The old woman had returned to her chair, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. It struck him that her confession had not been an act of courage, but of exhaustion. On the walk back to the station, Purbright replayed her story in his mind. If Herbert Cotterill had been innocent, then the wrong child mentioned in the note was real, and someone in Flaxborough had carried that guilt like a hymn stuck on a single line. At the corner near the churchyard, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure, slight, coat too large, cap pulled low, was standing near the vestry door. The moment Purbright turned, the figure slipped behind the yew trees and vanished into the mist. He did not follow. Instead, he stood listening to the faint hum of the organ drifting from within the church. One low, wavering note, uncertain but persistent, like memory refusing to fade. Sunday came with reluctant sunlight and the hollow quiet that precedes revelation. The church bells rang, but fewer parishioners than usual attended service, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps out of appetite for gossip unspoiled by fact. Reverend Flitch, pale yet steady, resumed the pulpit, his sermon wandering between forgiveness and fortitude. Purbright sat at the back, listening less to the words than to the room's unease. The townsfolk watched each other more than they listened to God. When the final hymn ended, Purbright waited until the congregation had dispersed, then walked slowly toward the vestry. He found Rudge there alone, closing the ledger with excessive care. The man's hands shook faintly, though his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Inspector, I'd like this business settled soon." "The rumours are, well, intolerable." "They usually are," Purbright said mildly. "I wonder, Mr. Rudge, if you recall a choirboy named Herbert Cotterill." The choirmaster froze for half a heartbeat. "Herbert? Good Lord, that was years ago. I thought that matter long forgotten." "It was," Purbright said, "until another Cotterill appeared. Edwin. His disappearance has stirred certain memories, hasn't it?" Rudge gave a brittle laugh.
"Coincidence, Inspector."
"You can't imagine I remember every child that passed through my choir." Purbright said nothing. He laid a photograph on the desk, one he had borrowed from Mrs. Penrith's mantle. A group of boys in robes, stiff and unsmiling. Rudge glanced at it, and something flickered behind his eyes. "He looks like Edwin," Purbright said quietly. "Same posture, same uncertain pride." Rudge turned away. "Herbert was a thief. It's all in the records." "Yes," Purbright replied. "Records you signed." Silence settled like dust. Somewhere outside, the faint laughter of children drifted from the square. Purbright continued, his tone even, almost conversational. "The missing donation, £50 in an envelope. The vicar poisoned by tea, only you prepared. These are small acts beside one large motive. Someone has been revisiting the sins of 20 years ago, reminding certain people what they prefer to forget." Rudge's shoulders sagged. "If you're suggesting I'm suggesting nothing yet," Purbright interrupted gently. "But you were the last to see the boy. You said he was tidying hymn sheets. You also said he might have seen you place the donation in the safe." Rudge's voice cracked slightly. "He didn't touch it."
"I swear it. I believe you," said Purbright, "and meant it."
"But someone else did. And whoever left that note knew both the story of Herbert Cotterill and your part in it. Perhaps someone who thought they were defending a family's name. Or redeeming it." A knock interrupted them. It was Sergeant Malley, his face pale. "Sir, something's turned up. By the riverbank." They followed him through the narrow lanes, past the mill and the allotments, until they reached the small bridge where children fished for minnows in summer. Beneath it, caught against the reeds, was a torn scrap of choir robe. Purbright knelt beside it, lifting the wet fabric carefully. A name tag, faded but legible, read E. Cotterill. Not far beyond, the grass bore the imprint of knees, and the earth was disturbed as if someone had knelt there recently. Lying half buried in the mud was a small tin harmonica. Purbright brushed it clean, raised it briefly to his ear, and shook it. It gave no sound. He couldn't sing, he murmured, almost to himself. But he found another way to make music. That evening he sat once more in his office, the harmonica before him, the evidence arranged like an unfinished hymn. He wrote slowly, thinking aloud as he did when the logic began to settle. A note written by an old hand.
A donation vanishes, a vicar poisoned mildly, mercifully.
And a boy, descendant of the wronged, used as instrument or warning.
No malice, only restitution, he leaned back, eyes narrowing.
The child's disappearance wasn't escape, it was arrangement. He was hidden, perhaps even protected. The door opened softly. It was the vicar, walking with care but determination.
Inspector, I've remembered something, he said.
The morning before the service, a woman came to me, Mrs. Penrith. She asked if she might take Edwin's hymn book home to look over some old verses. I thought it odd, but she seemed harmless. Purbright closed his notebook. Not harmless, vicar. Just tired of waiting for justice to sing its last line. The harmonica caught the lamplight, dull and silver. He touched it once, then rose, reaching for his coat. We'll pay her another visit. It seems our choirboy may never have sung, but others have been singing for him all along. By Monday, the town's excitement had subsided into a wary quiet. The riverbank, where the choir robe had been found, was cordoned off with little ceremony, and the townsfolk, having exhausted every rumour, began returning to their lives, though with a touch of theatrical piety. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had settled into the patient rhythm that preceded his final test. His method was never confrontation, but arrangement. People, like hymns, revealed their discord when placed in harmony. That morning, he asked Reverend Flitch to invite a small circle to luncheon at the vicarage, those directly or indirectly touched by the affair. The pretext was gratitude for assistance during his recent illness. It would, Flitch said cautiously, be a modest gathering of the Christianly inclined. By noon, the guests were assembled, Mr. Rudge precise and perspiring, Mrs. Pocklington gloved and radiant with curiosity, Mrs. Wapshot formidable in mauve, and Mrs. Penrith pale, her composure drawn tight as lace. Purbright arrived last, taking the seat nearest the window where he could observe faces against the light. The vicar began with a speech of weary benevolence. He thanked them for their patience under trial, then called for tea. The silver tray appeared, carried by Sergeant Malley in borrowed butler's attire, a detail that amused Purbright and no one else. Cups were poured, spoons clinked, and conversation drifted toward the weather. Purbright let it. He waited until the table had settled, until small talk softened the edges of discomfort. Then, in his mildest tone, he said, "An odd thing about hymns, don't you find? They carry meaning even for those who can't sing a note. Take number 47, for instance." Rudge's spoon slipped. Mrs. Penrith's hand tightened on her cup. The others, sensing a private reference, glanced around uncertainly. Number 47, Purbright continued, was marked in one of the choir hymnals, alongside others, on confession and silence.
Edwin Cotterill's hymnal, as it happens. I wonder who chose them. No one spoke.
The vicar frowned slightly, puzzled. Purbright let the silence breathe. "It's remarkable," he said, "how carefully someone orchestrated this affair. A note placed beneath a hymnal.
A missing donation.
A poisoning too mild to kill. Even the disappearance of a boy, each act a variation on one theme, penance. Someone's been conducting an old guilt to its close." Mrs. Penrith looked up, her face drained. "You think I think you believe justice had waited long enough," Purbright said softly. "Herbert Cotterill was shamed and ruined for a theft he didn't commit. The man who signed that judgment," he turned to Rudge, "was never challenged, until his nephew appeared, a living echo of the past." Mrs. Penrith's voice trembled. "I never meant harm, only truth. The boy, he came to me after practice. Said Mr. Rudge had scolded him, said he'd been accused of touching the offertory bag. He cried, 'Inspector,' like a child reliving another's sorrow. I told him to hide for a day or two, just until I could make them see." Rudge rose, his face blotched red. "She's deranged! The money was stolen. The vicar—" "The money," Purbright interrupted, "was found this morning in the church safe, where it had always been."
"It seems someone simply miscounted." Rudge froze. Mrs. Wapshot made a noise of affronted confusion. Purbright continued, still calm. "As for the vicar's tea, arsenic was never found. The faintness was caused by a sedative. The cup had been tampered with, yes, but not poisoned."
"Whoever mixed it meant to frighten, not to kill." Mrs. Penrith's eyes glistened. "I only wished for him to see what fear feels like, the fear he caused that mother. I placed the note, yes, and I told Edwin to sing from the old hymnal. I thought the truth would come gently." "It seldom does," Purbright murmured. She bowed her head, whispering, "Where is he, the boy?" Purbright's tone softened. "Safe. A farmer found him at his barn near the mill road. Hungry, but unharmed. He'll be home by evening." The vicar crossed himself faintly. Mrs. Pocklington dabbed her eyes, though whether from sympathy or thwarted excitement was unclear. Purbright stood. "It's curious, isn't it? In Flaxborough, guilt never quite dies. It only waits for its audience. We prefer our confessions sung by someone else." He left them there, each absorbed in their own silence, and stepped out into the pale sunlight. Behind him, the faint strains of a hymn rose from the open window. The voice was uneven, fragile, but unmistakably young. The following morning unfolded with an almost indecent calm, as though the town, having tasted scandal, now sought digestion. The mist had lifted from the churchyard, revealing the stones slick and clean, and Inspector Purbright, with his customary, unhurried gait, made his way to the vicarage for one final visit. He carried no notebook, no file, only a faint air of inevitability. Reverend Flitch received him in the study, where the smell of furniture polish and weak tea competed for dominance. Mrs. Penrith sat opposite, hands clasped in her lap, like a penitent pupil. Mr. Rudge stood near the window, staring out at the gravestones. His posture had the stiff defiance of a man preparing to be misunderstood. Purbright declined the vicar's offer of tea and settled himself in a chair. "It seems," he began mildly, "we have reached the point where all explanations are less about blame than balance." Mrs. Penrith looked up first, her voice steady but small. "You know everything now, Inspector. I only wish to undo what was done to Herbert. When I saw Edwin, so like him, I felt God had sent me a reminder. I thought the truth could be coaxed into the open, gently, decently. Instead," Purbright said, "it arrived by sermon and scandal." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I meant no harm to the boy. I told him to hide at the mill-keeper's barn, to frighten them into remembering. The note under the hymnal, it was mine."
"And the candle in the vestry. I was there that night. I saw the envelope, the donation. I only wished to show Mr. Rudge that old wrongs burn longer than wax." Purbright inclined his head. "And the vicar's tea? I replaced his sugar with a sedative from my cupboard. A nurse once gave it me for sleep. It was foolish, I know. I wanted him too to feel what it is to wake uncertain of one's conscience." Reverend Flitch gave a faint, bewildered smile. "Well, Mrs. Penrith, I must say I have felt precisely that for most of my career."
Rudge turned from the window at last. "And what of me, Inspector? I've been made a villain in all this, yet I did nothing unlawful." Purbright looked at him evenly. "Perhaps not, but sometimes lawfulness and decency part company without ever divorcing. You signed the dismissal of a boy you knew was innocent." Rudge's mouth tightened. There was pressure from the council. The matter of his parentage, his mother's reputation, there were concerns. "In Flaxborough," Purbright said gently, "concern is often cruelty in better clothes." The silence that followed was thick, but oddly peaceful. Outside, the bells began to toll the quarter hour, the sound steady and impersonal. Mrs. Penrith rose, her composure gone. "You'll arrest me, of course. I've broken laws, even if only small ones." Purbright shook his head. "No, you'll write a statement. The rest I'll leave to the bishop, who's fond of moral tangles. Edwin is home now, unharmed. He's asked to rejoin the choir. That seems judgment enough." Her breath caught.
"He's safe?"
"Quite. He's even learned to blow that harmonica of his without producing a sound, which may be the purest form of music this town has yet heard." A faint laugh escaped her, fragile, almost grateful. She sank back into the chair, tears slipping freely now. Rudge remained unmoving, his face drained of colour. Purbright stood, buttoning his coat. The past, Mr. Rudge, is not a thing one buries by silence. It tends to sing when one least expects it. The choirmaster said nothing, only lowered his eyes. When Purbright reached the door, Reverend Flitch spoke softly. "Inspector, I hope there's some forgiveness in this somewhere." "There usually is," Purbright replied. "It just takes the long way round." He left the vicarage to the faint hum of the organ warming for rehearsal. As he crossed the churchyard, he paused, listening. The boys' voices drifted out, wavering, uncertain but sincere. Among them, faint yet unmistakable, was one that had never before been heard. The following Sunday dawned with the particular stillness that settles over English towns after scandal, an almost guilty serenity, as if the streets themselves were trying not to be overheard. The church bell rang on time, its tone cleaner, its echo brighter, as though even metal had chosen to forget. Inside St. Cuthbert's, the congregation returned at last in full number. Curiosity now softened into something resembling relief. Inspector Purbright occupied his familiar seat near the back, inconspicuous as ever. His case reports were already written, though he had submitted them with the brevity of a man who valued understatement above triumph. Matter resolved. Boy located. No prosecution recommended. He had left out, as always, the human fragments that made such conclusions possible, the tremor in a widow's voice, the blush of shame in a choirmaster's cheeks, the faint courage of a boy's first note sung without fear. Reverend Flitch's sermon that morning was shorter than usual. He spoke of mistakes, of mercy, and of the peculiar grace of being wrong in good faith. It was, Purbright thought, the finest homily the man had ever given, precisely because it contained no names and no certainties. Mrs. Penrith was not present. She had taken, as the vicar put it, a short retreat at her sister's in Lincoln, though it was clear to most that her absence was less retreat than quiet exile. Mr. Rudge had resigned his post as choirmaster on grounds of nervous strain, but remained in town, seen often walking the lanes at dusk, as though listening for a music that no longer answered him. And Edwin Cotterell, well, the boy was there, smaller than his story, larger than his reputation. He stood among the choir, pale but upright, and when the first hymn began, he opened his mouth and sang. The note was thin, a little hesitant, but unmistakably real. It quavered, steadied, and found its place among the others. Purbright, hearing it, allowed himself the rarest of luxuries, a smile. After the service, the townsfolk lingered longer than usual, exchanging greetings that had not been offered in months. Even Mrs. Wapshot managed a charitable nod to Mrs. Pocklington, who returned it with the air of one forgiving from a great moral height. The scandal, as all Flaxborough scandals did, began to dissolve into anecdote, destined to be retold with minor embellishments until one day no one quite remembered what had truly happened. Purbright left the churchyard quietly, the sound of the choir still trailing faintly behind him. Outside the air was brisk and clean. He stopped by the river, where reeds whispered against the current, and took from his pocket the small harmonica he had kept since the investigation's end. He turned it once in his fingers, listening to the wind play softly through its holes. It made no tune, only a sigh, the gentlest kind of confession. Back at his office, he wrote a brief note for the file. Certain wrongs are not crimes but echoes, audible only when the world grows quiet enough to hear them. The business of justice, therefore, is sometimes to listen. He closed the folder and placed it neatly in the drawer marked Miscellaneous Moral. Then, with habitual precision, he poured himself a modest cup of tea, stirred it twice, and regarded the steam rising from the cup with a faint, ironic amusement. Outside, Flaxborough returned to its ordinary pace. Bicycles clattered past, shop bells chimed, and the Rose and Crown reopened early for those requiring post-sermonal reflection. The town, as always, would endure, slightly improved, faintly wiser, but fundamentally unchanged. As the clock in the market square struck noon, Purbright leaned back, the corners of his mouth curving just so. "Well," he murmured to no one in particular, "it appears even silence can be taught to sing." He picked up his pen, adjusted the blotter, and began the next report with his usual care. Outside, from somewhere down the lane, came the faint echo of a hymn, clear, unhurried, and, at last, perfectly in tune.